A man facing an overwhelming defeat, captured, disarmed, and humiliated. Everyone thought his spirit would be broken, but his pride was his armor. He knew the German soldiers were the strongest in the world. But what happened when he was confronted with a power far greater than will? Get ready for a story that isn't about a battle of guns, but a battle of belief. A story that will make you rethink what true strength really looks like. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. The cold of the Ardennes forest bit deep, a physical pain that even Colonel Friedrich Schiller's stiff-backed pride could not entirely ignore. It was January 1945, and the great German offensive, Wacht am Rhein, what the Americans called the Battle of the Bulge, had ruptured. The initial glorious surge was over. Now, it was about survival, about a fighting retreat. Or, in Schiller's case, the end of the fight. His capture had been undramatic. Not a heroic last stand, but a sudden ambush by a squad of young American GIs emerging from a fog near the village of Foy. Their faces were smudged with dirt, but their eyes were sharp, their M1 Garens level with a confident ease. There was no time for a final gesture. One moment he was orchestrating the movement of his depleted battalion. The next he was disarmed, his prize Luger now a trophy in the hands of a freckle-faced sergeant who couldn't have been older than 20. Now he sat in the back of a bouncing American deuce-and-a-half truck, his hands bound loosely. Across from him, two of his junior officers, Lieutenants Brem and Vogel, shared the space. Their faces were masks of shame and exhaustion. Schiller straightened his spine, the wool of his greatcoat scratching his neck. "Maintain your composure," Schiller said, his voice a low, steady rumble in German. "They have captured us, but they have not defeated our spirit. Remember who you are. We are officers of the Wehrmacht." Brem merely nodded, staring at his boots. Vogel, younger, more fiery, clenched his fists. "They got lucky, Herr Oberst." The weather cleared. Their J-bows, their fighter-bombers, he trailed off, the memory of the relentless P-47 Thunderbolts strafing their columns evidently still fresh. "Luck is a factor in all wars, Vogel," Schiller replied, his gaze fixed on the passing, snow-dusted pine trees. "But what wins them? Our will has been tested in the crucible of the Eastern Front. Theirs? These Americans are children playing at war. They rely on machinery, not metal. They have no stomach for a real fight." He truly believed it. The intelligence briefing spoke of America's fledgling army, its lack of experience, its reliance on overwhelming material. To Schiller, this was a weakness. War was an art of maneuvering scarce resources, of imposing will through hardship and discipline. A soldier who had known shortage was a soldier who knew how to endure. A soldier who had everything was soft, dependent. He had seen the evidence himself. American prisoners often had chocolate and cigarettes in their pockets, luxuries his own men hadn't seen in years. It spoke of profound unseriousness. The truck rumbled on, joining a convoy heading west, away from the front. Schiller expected to see signs of the desperate, chaotic rear of an army. The broken-down vehicles, the supply dumps picked clean, the haggard faces of support troops that were so familiar on his own side. Instead, he saw the opposite. The roads, though muddy, were a relentless river of American might. Trucks, tanks, jeeps, all moving with purpose. They passed a team of engineers already repairing a bridge blown just days before, working with an efficiency that rivaled anything he'd seen in the Reich. It was unsettling. Vogel noticed it too. "The traffic, it never stops," he muttered, almost to himself. Schiller dismissed it with a wave of his hand. A show of force. They must project an image of strength. Underneath, it is a fragile facade. You will see. He clung to this belief as their truck finally slowed and turned off the main road. They had reached a processing point, a temporary POW cage set up in a vast, open field. It was surrounded by chain-link fence and watchtowers with machine guns. The sight of his men, hundreds of them, huddled in groups in the cold, was a blow to his pride. But even here, he looked for cracks in the American system. The guards seemed vigilant but not cruel. There was no brutality, just a cold, administrative efficiency. As an officer, he was separated from the enlisted men. A young American captain with a tired but polite demeanor processed him, taking his name, rank, and serial number. The captain offered him a cigarette. Schiller refused with a cold stare. The American shrugged, lit one for himself, and continued with his paperwork. The courtesy was more disorienting than hostility would have been. It didn't fit the narrative of the barbaric enemy Berlin's propaganda had preached. A small seed of doubt, tiny and unwelcome, was planted. Later that evening, as a thin, freezing rain began to fall, a commotion arose near the gate. An American major was pointing at Schiller and his officers, barking orders to a sergeant. Schiller stood up, ready for an interrogation, ready to defend his honor with nothing but his name, rank, and number. This was a test of will he knew he could win. The sergeant approached. You, with me, he said, pointing to Schiller, Brehm, and Vogel. What is the meaning of this? Schiller demanded in his best English. The sergeant, a burly man with a Brooklyn accent, just jerked his thumb toward a waiting jeep. Relocation. We're moving you west. Seems you're too important to keep up here, so close to the line. This was it. The journey to a proper POW camp. Schiller steeled himself. It would be a new front in the war, a battle of wits and endurance. He climbed into the jeep, his back rod straight, his eyes forward, ready for the next trial. He was Colonel Friedrich Schiller, and he would not be broken. The real war, the war of spirit, was just beginning. Little did he know, his war was about to end in a place he never expected, an American supply depot. The jeep ride was a study in jarring contrasts. Colonel Schiller clung to the cold metal frame as the vehicle bounced and swerved along the congested road. He had expected a hasty, perhaps even panicked, retreat to the rear. Instead, he found himself in the middle of what could only be described as a mechanized parade of breathtaking scale. The road was a double-laned river of steel and olive drab, flowing ceaselessly toward the front. Brand-new Sherman tanks, their tracks still clean, rolled east on tank transporters. Endless lines of GMC trucks, each one loaded to the brim with crates, barrels, and canvas-covered supplies, created a low, rumbling thunder that was the bass note of this symphony of might. Jeeps darted in and out like nimble fish, officers shouting directions that were swallowed by the diesel-choked air. Schiller's initial theory of a facade began to crumble. A facade was something you put up quickly to hide an ugly truth. This was too organic, too deeply rooted, too massive to be fake. This was the circulatory system of a giant, and it was pumping with relentless, powerful beats. His two junior officers in the back of the jeep saw it too. Lieutenant Vogel's angry defiance had melted into a silent, wide-eyed astonishment. Lieutenant Brehm, avid pragmatist, simply watched, his analytical mind undoubtedly calculating the staggering logistical implications of each truck that passed. Their American driver, a corporal named Jimmy with a wad of chewing tobacco in his cheek, seemed utterly bored by the spectacle. He hummed a tune unfamiliar to Schiller, occasionally cursing good-naturedly at a truck that cut him off. "Quite a traffic jam," Schiller said in his careful, accented English, attempting to glean some information, to find a crack. The corporal glanced at him in the rear-view mirror, a flicker of surprise that a German officer would speak. "Ain't a jam, sir," he said casually. "This is just a regular Tuesday. You should see it when we're really moving stuff." The casualness of the statement was a dagger. A regular Tuesday. Schiller thought of the roads back to Germany, clogged with horse-drawn carts, with men hitchhiking on any vehicle that could move, with precious fuel convoys desperately trying to slip through to the front under constant threat of annihilation. He saw a truck laden with nothing but wooden crates of Coca-Cola bottles. He blinked, unsure if the cold was affecting his vision. After hours of driving, the character of the landscape began to change. The dense forests and rugged hills gave way to flatter, more open land. The signs of war receded, replaced by signs of immense organization. They passed enormous airfields, not with a few scattered planes, but with row upon row of Silver B-17 Flying Fortresses and P-51 Mustangs, lined up like cars in a dealer's lot, waiting for their turn to fly. The scale was no longer impressive. It was oppressive. It was deafening. The jeep finally turned off the main highway, down a narrower but well-maintained road, and toward a complex that made Schiller's breath catch in his throat. It was a city made of stuff. They had arrived at a Red Ball Express depot, one of the massive logistical hubs feeding the Allied advance. It stretched to the horizon, a geometric landscape of mind-boggling abundance. Warehouses the size of city blocks stood beside open fields that were not fields at all, but meticulously organized storage yards. Mountains of crates, each one stamped with U.S. Army markings, reached 20, 30 feet into the air. There were pyramids of artillery shells, stacks of tires taller than a house, acres of parked jeeps and trucks under canvas covers, waiting for drivers. The air, once filled with the smell of pine and cordite, was now thick with the scent of gasoline, fresh lumber, and paint. The driver pulled the jeep to a stop near a processing office. "Wait here," he said, hopping out to report in. Schiller, Brem, and Vogel could only stare. The 3 German officers, men who had commanded troops in the Crucible War, were rendered utterly silent. This was not the rear area of an army. This was the industrial heart of a nation, transplanted onto European soil. Vogel was the first to speak, his voice a hollow whisper. For Oberst, the reports, they said their supplies were low. They said they were stretching their fuel to the limit. He pointed a trembling finger at a row of massive cylindrical fuel tanks. "Look." Schiller followed his gaze. A line of tanker trucks was filling up from the tanks, each one taking on thousands of liters of gasoline without a second thought. He thought of the German Panther tanks abandoned on the roads of Bastogne, their engines silent, their fuel gauges reading empty. He thought of the prized jerrycan of fuel being more valuable than a medal. Brem, the pragmatist, began to mutter numbers under his breath, calculating the caloric intake suggested by the warehouses full of rations, the ammunition stores, the replacement parts. His face grew pale. "It is not possible," he murmured, not to anyone in particular. "The tonnage, the shipping, it is a mathematical impossibility." But it was possible. It was right in front of them. The sheer, undeniable physical reality of it was a force that began to crush Schiller's carefully constructed worldview. This was not about the will of the individual soldier. How could it be? This was about the will of an entire nation, a nation that could cross an ocean and rebuild its industrial might on a foreign continent, all while fighting a war on 2 fronts. A company of American infantry marched past them, heading toward a mess tent. They were clean. Their uniforms were new, or at least intact. They joked with each other, their faces well-fed. Schiller looked at his own uniform, once a symbol of pride, now torn and stained with the mud of a lost battle. He saw the hollow cheeks of his junior officers, the hunger that had been their constant companion for years. The driver returned with a military policeman. "All right, fellas, this is your stop. You'll be processed and put on a train tomorrow." As they were led toward a temporary holding pen, Schiller walked like a man in a dream. The sounds of the depot were a foreign language he was suddenly beginning to understand. The shriek of forklifts, the shouts of warehouse foremen, the constant beeping of trucks in reverse, the distant hum of generators. It was a sound of inevitability. He had believed the war would be won by the side with the strongest spirit. Now, for the first time, a terrifying thought crept into his mind, cold and absolute. The war would be won by the side that could replace a broken truck tire before the other side had even managed to find a horse. The holding pen was a repurposed livestock stable on the edge of the sprawling depot. Its earthy scent a stark contrast to the industrial odors outside. For Colonel Schiller, the rough-hewn walls and simple straw bedding were a perverse comfort. This was a form of captivity he understood, sparse, functional, and humbling. It was an environment designed to break a man's spirit through deprivation. It was a battle he was prepared to fight, but the battle never came. The American Guards were not the brutish ogres of Nazi propaganda. They were mostly older men, past their prime for frontline duty, who performed their tasks with a bored efficiency. One of them, a Sergeant Miller with a pronounced limp and a kind face, brought them a meal shortly after they were locked in. It was not the thin gruel or hard black bread Schiller expected. It was 3 mess tins containing a stew thick with chunks of meat, potatoes, and carrots. Alongside it were hardtack biscuits, a pat of actual butter, a packet of crackers, and a small bar of chocolate. The sight of it was so absurd that Lieutenant Vogel initially refused to touch it, suspecting some kind of trick. Sergeant Miller, noticed his hesitation. "It's all right, son," he said, his voice gravelly. "Ain't poison. Just chow." He leaned against the stable door. "Heard you fellas had a rough time of it up in the bulge. Figured you could use a hot meal." The kindness was more disarming than any cruelty. Vogel, his suspicion warring with his gnawing hunger, finally picked up a biscuit. The crunch seemed deafening in the quiet stable. Brehm ate with methodical, stunned silence, his eyes distant, still doing the math of the depot outside. Schiller ate slowly. The food was good. Too good. It was a meal of an army that did not just feed its soldiers, but nourished them. He thought of his own men, their rations reduced to frozen potatoes, and the occasional scrawny horse slaughtered for meat. He thought of the letters from his wife in Dresden, speaking of the endless queues for a handful of turnips. This simple American stew became a symbol of a gulf, so wide he could barely see the other side. The night was long and cold. The sounds of the depot never fully ceased. The distant rumble of generators and the occasional shout created a constant, low-grade hum of activity. Schiller lay on his bed of straw, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the ragged breathing of his officers. He could feel their unspoken questions hanging in the frozen air. His own certainty, the core of his command, was fracturing. The next morning, the same Sergeant Miller arrived with a steaming pot of coffee. The rich, alien aroma filled the stable. "All right, time to move out. Train's here," he announced cheerfully. They were marched out into the biting dawn. The scale of the depot, partially obscured by mist the evening before, was now revealed in the stark morning light, and it was even more terrifying. The organized mountains of supplies seemed to have grown overnight. Convoys were already lining up, engines coughing to life, ready to begin the daily pilgrimage to the front. Their destination was a railway siding where a train of battered boxcars waited. But it was a loading process that held Schiller transfixed. A massive crane, its arms swinging with a lazy, powerful grace, was moving entire trucks from a flatbed car onto the ground. GIs swarmed over the operation, but the heavy lifting was done by machine. Schiller's mind flashed to Port Brest. Months earlier, he had watched teams of 60, 100 men, starving Russian POWs and forced laborers, struggling for days to unload a single freighter by hand, their bodies breaking under the weight of crates, dying under the whips of their overseers. The slowness of it, the horrific inefficiency, had been accepted as the natural order of war. Here, there was no whips, just a steady, unhurried chug of the crane's engine. One truck, then another, settled onto the ground in minutes. The Americans weren't just moving material. They were moving time itself. They were compressing weeks of manual labor into hours. He stood there, rooted to the spot, watching his ballet of abundance and efficiency. The guards, seeing the senior officer was causing no trouble, didn't rush him. They let him watch. He saw 2 GIs wrestling with a crate that had broken open. Its contents spilled into the mud, dozens of cans of something called Spam. The 2 soldiers groaned, not in despair at the loss of precious food, but at the annoyance of having to clean it up. One of them kicked the can absently with his boot. Schiller felt a physical pain in his chest. Food, kicked into the mud like rubbish. In that single careless gesture, he saw the entire truth. This was not an army living on a knife's edge. This was an army that could afford to waste. Waste was a luxury born of absolute, unquestionable surplus. It was a luxury his side had not known since 1939. A revelation, cold and absolute, washed over him. It was not a strategic insight about flanking maneuvers or air superiority. It was simpler, more profound, and far more devastating. The war was not a contest of tactics or will between armies. It was over. It had been over for a long time, and he had been too blind, too invested in the myth of martial spirit to see it. The Americans were not fighting the German army. They were simply processing. They were an immense, inexorable system, a combined harvester moving slowly across a field. The German army was just the stubborn stalks of wheat that hadn't yet been gathered and threshed. The sound of the crane, the chatter of the GIs, the smell of diesel and coffee, all fused into a single, horrifying message of defeat. His shoulders, always held so rigidly straight, slumped almost imperceptibly, The cold air he breathed and felt different. It was the air of a new world, one his country had already lost. "Colonel," Lieutenant Brem's voice was tentative, concerned. "Are you unwell?" Schiller did not look at him. His eyes were still fixed on the spot where the can of Spam lay in the mud. "No, Brem," he said, his voice quiet, stripped of all its former authority. It was just the voice of a tired man. "I am perfectly well. For the first time, I believe I am—" He turned finally, and the look in his eyes, a hollow, stunned acceptance, silenced any further questions from his subordinates. The unbroken pride had finally shattered. The train journey west was a descent into a silent, private hell for Colonel Schiller. The clattering of the wheels on the tracks became a monotonous drumbeat, accompanying the funeral march of his convictions. He sat on the hard wooden bench of the boxcar, his back against the slatted wall, and stared out at the passing French countryside without seeing it. His two junior officers, Vogel and Brem, left him to his silence. They could see the change in him. The iron rod of his posture was gone, replaced by a weary slump. The commanding fire in his eyes had been extinguished, leaving behind two pools of quiet devastation. They whispered each other, attributing it to the fatigue of capture, the shock of defeat. They didn't understand. Their colonel hadn't been defeated. He had been enlightened, and the knowledge was a crushing weight. The landscape outside the boxcar window was a rolling testament to American methodical progress. They passed repaired depots where lines of damaged tanks and trucks were being fixed not by teams of frantic mechanics, but by assembly line processes. They passed more airfields, each one a sprawling hive of activity. They saw endless trains like their own, heading east, loaded not with troops, but with pallets of shells, crates of rations, stacks of artillery pieces. The unglamorous, essential lifeblood of an army. Each sight was a hammer blow on the anvil of Schiller's new understanding. This wasn't the desperate, patchwork effort of a nation straining its resources. This was the calm, confident output of a giant that was only just beginning to flex its muscles. The Ardennes offensive, Germany's last great gamble, hadn't been defeated by a peer. It had been swallowed whole by this immense machine and digested without a hiccup. His mind became a courtroom, and he was both prosecutor and accused. He prosecuted the lies he'd been fed, the lies he believed, the lies he had, in turn, fed to the men under his command. Hold the line. The Führer has new wonder weapons. Outside, a truck park stretched for acres, each vehicle identical and new. The Americans are soft. They will break under pressure. He saw a mobile kitchen unit serving hot food to GIs, the smell of fresh coffee wafting even to the moving train. Our will is stronger. Our spirit is forged in hardship. He saw a team of engineers launching a prefabricated bridge across a river, completing in hours a task that would have taken his own pioneers weeks. The evidence was irrefutable. The verdict was in. Guilty of a catastrophic failure of perception. Guilty of believing his own propaganda. He thought of his men. The young boys from the Hitler Youth, their faces pale with fear and cold, clutching their single-shot Panzerfaust, told they could stop a column of Shermans with courage alone. He thought of the veterans from the East, their eyes old and young faces, who had followed him because they trusted his judgment, because he had promised them the fight could still be won. He had offered them spirit as a weapon against this tidal wave of plenty. A profound and sickening shame washed over him. Their sacrifices, their frostbitten limbs, their lives lost in the snowy forests, had they been for anything? Or had they simply been delaying the inevitable, futile gestures against a machine that could not be stopped? He had commanded them with the belief that their courage could change the calculus of war. Now, he saw that courage didn't factor into the equation at all. The equation was about production quotas, shipping tonnage, and fuel reserves. The war wasn't lost on the battlefield. It was lost in the factories of Detroit and the shipyards of Baltimore. It was lost in the wheat fields of Kansas and the oil fields of Texas. It was lost before the first American soldier ever set foot on French soil. The boxcar was cold, but Schiller felt a colder chill from within. This was the true prison, not the wooden walls around him, but the walls of his own mind that had finally collapsed in on him, revealing a terrifyingly vast and empty landscape of truth. He was a soldier without a war, a commander without a command, a believer whose God had just been proven false. Lieutenant Vogel finally dared to break the silence. Her Oberst? We will be exchanged? Surely. This is just a temporary setback. The fatherland will. Schiller turned his head slowly. The movement seemed to require immense effort. He looked at Vogel, really looked at him, seeing the desperate, fragile hope in the young man's eyes. He saw himself from just 2 days ago. Vogel, he interrupted, his voice a dry, raspy thing. The fatherland is finished. The words hung in the frigid air, absolute and final. Vogel recoiled as if struck. Brem stared, his mouth slightly agape. Sir, you cannot mean that. Vogel protested, his voice rising with panic. We have sworn oaths. We must have faith. What is faith? Schiller said. His gaze returned to the window, to the endless proof rolling past. Against the endless supply of reality, he fell silent again, retreating back into his thoughts. He had given his orders. The war was over. The only battle left was to survive the peace, and to somehow live with the knowledge of what that peace had cost, and how utterly avoidable it might have been had they only seen the truth in time. The two younger officers exchanged a horrified glance. The unshakable pillar of their world had not just cracked. It had spoken, and it had told them everything they believed in was a lie. The rest of the journey passed in a silence more profound and terrifying than any they had ever experienced. The final destination was a proper POW camp. Stalag XIA, a sprawling compound of barbed wire, watchtowers, and long, low barracks huts. The processing was as efficient and impersonal as everything else Schiller had witnessed. He was catalogued, given a prisoner number, and assigned to a hut with other senior officers. The environment was stark, but it was clean and orderly. There were no beatings, no deliberate cruelty. It was like the supply depot, a system designed for containment, not for extermination. The very normalcy of it was its own form of psychological warfare. The camp was a microcosm of the dying Reich. Men clung to the ragged remnants of their hierarchy and their beliefs. Old generals held strategy meetings, debating phantom divisions and impossible counteroffensives. Younger officers, like Vogel, spoke in hushed, fervent tones about the mythical Alpine redoubt where the Führer would make his last stand. The air was thick with denial, a desperate collective fantasy woven from scraps of hope and propaganda. Schiller moved through it all like a ghost. He performed his duties, attended the mandatory roll calls, but he was apart. The fire was gone. He had seen the future, and it was made of steel, gasoline, and Spam. The breaking point came a week later. He was standing in line for the midday meal, a thin soup and a portion of black bread, a ration that was, ironically, far more familiar to him than the American stew had been. A young major named Kessler, newly arrived and still burning with defiant arrogance, was holding court in the line. It is a simple matter of will, Kessler proclaimed, his voice ringing with certainty. The Americans have no stomach for a long occupation. Their home front is weak. When we break out of the Alpine fortress and link with the werewolf guerrillas, their entire army will collapse. They are a house of cards. Men around him nodded, their eyes hungry for this narrative. It was the same story Schiller had told himself in the back of the truck. It felt like a lifetime ago. Schiller listened, the words washing over him. He saw the eager faces, the desperate need to believe. He saw Vogel, nodding along, try to reignite his own extinguished defiance. And something within him, something that had once been a colonel responsible for the lives of his men, finally broke its silence. He stepped forward. The line went quiet. All eyes turned to the senior officer who had been so distant. Major Kessler, Schiller said, his voice low, but carrying an unnatural weight that silenced the entire yard. You are mistaken. Kessler blinked, affronted. With all due respect, Herr Oberst, my intelligence. Your intelligence is a fairy tale, Schiller interrupted, not with anger, but with a devastating, flat finality. I have seen their intelligence. It is not in briefings or documents. It is in the mud at a supply depot you cannot possibly imagine. He paused, looking at the circle of gaunt, proud faces. These were his countrymen, his brothers in arms. They deserved the truth, even if it killed them. I saw them, he continued. his voice gaining a strange, quiet power. I saw them unload trucks from trains with machines that did the work of 100 men. I saw them kick cans of meat into the mud because the crate had broken. I saw their soldiers, not with stale bread and ersatz coffee, but with chocolate and butter and coffee so real you could smell it 100 meters away. He took a step closer to the stunned Major Kessler. You speak of their weak home front? I saw their home front. It is here, in France. They have brought it with them. They have not stretched their supply lines. They have built a new highway across an ocean and paved it with everything their factories can produce. We are not fighting men. We are fighting against the output of 1,000 factories that have never heard a bomb fall. We are not soldiers to them. We are a logistical problem to be processed. The silence in the compound was absolute. You could hear the wind whistling through the barbed wire. They don't need to have stomach for a fight, Major, Schiller said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. They simply open a can, and they have all the stomach they need. The war is not lost. It is over. It has been over for years. We just didn't know it yet. He turned away from Kessler, his eyes sweeping over the assembled prisoners. He saw the dawning horror in Brem's eyes, the shattered confusion in Vogel's. He saw denial crumbling on other faces. He had not given them a speech of inspiration. He had performed an autopsy on their hope. He walked away from the chow line, leaving his untouched meal behind. He had no appetite. He had finally spoken the truth that had been consuming him, and in doing so, he had crossed a final, irrevocable threshold. The colonel was gone. The prisoner remained. But he was a prisoner who was finally free of the lies. He found a quiet spot near the fence, away from the others, and looked out past the wire. The war outside would rage for a few more months. But for Friedrich Schiller, it had ended on a gray day, in a place overflowed with the endless, mundane bounty of a country that had already won. The story of Colonel Friedrich Schiller is a powerful reminder that true strength often lies not just in courage, but in the unshakable foundation of support behind it. It's a lesson in perception, in seeing the truth beyond the story we're told, and in finding the courage to accept it, even when it's the hardest thing to do. If the story of perspective and profound realization move you, if it made you think about the unseen forces that shape our lives, then do us a favor. Subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into history's most compelling human stories. Hit the like button if you believe in the power of truth, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next journey into the past, where we forever search for the lessons that can guide our future.